F. H. Bradley, an influential English philosopher, is best known for his contributions to idealism, ethics, and metaphysical theory. His philosophy centers on the idea that the self is inherently incomplete and that true fulfillment can only be attained by aligning the individual with the greater totality, which he refers to as the absolute. Bradley's work often explores the conflict between individual desire and universal reality, emphasizing the limitations of human experience and the difficulties inherent in reconciling the finite self with the infinite. This video aims to delve into the darker aspects of Bradley's philosophy, specifically examining the motivations that drive human beings and the existential struggles they encounter in their search for meaning. The following lessons explore the tension between individual and collective good, the failure of ethical systems, the illusion of the self, and the inevitable frustration that marks the human condition. 1. The illusion of the self. Bradley's metaphysical system is built upon the idea that the self is not an independent, self-sustaining entity but rather an illusion created by the individual's perception of separateness. He argues that the true nature of reality is an undivided totality, which he calls the absolute, and that individuals are incomplete fragments of this greater unity. The psychological impact of the illusion of the self. The darker motivation here arises from the recognition that human beings are constantly driven by an illusion of selfhood. People cling to an image of themselves as separate and distinct individuals, which leads to a sense of isolation and incompleteness. The drive to seek fulfillment, whether through relationships, careers, or personal achievements, is rooted in this illusion, as individuals are unaware that their sense of separateness is the very thing preventing them from experiencing true unity with the absolute. The psychological impact is profound. People are perpetually dissatisfied, as their goals and desires are based on an incomplete view of themselves and the world. Bradley's notion of the self as an illusion calls into question the entire structure of personal identity. If the self is a false construct, then the motivations driven by this false sense of individuality are fundamentally flawed. This creates a paradoxical situation in which individuals are continually striving for something that is ultimately unattainable. The deeper we delve into this concept, the more we see how deeply it affects human behavior. The pursuit of personal goals, for example, is often motivated by a desire to affirm one's existence, to feel validated in a world that constantly reinforces the illusion of separateness. But the more people seek to validate themselves, the more they are trapped in an endless cycle of craving recognition and never truly achieving peace. Existential frustration and the search for unity. The search for unity with the absolute is a recurring theme in Bradley's philosophy, and it is this search that leads to existential frustration. Human beings are constantly motivated by the need to reconcile their finite selves with the infinite, but this reconciliation is impossible to achieve. The illusion of selfhood prevents the individual from experiencing the world as it truly is. This existential frustration manifests in various ways: a sense of alienation, disillusionment with societal values, and the realization that one's efforts to assert control over one's life are often futile. The search for unity, then, becomes a kind of dark motivation, one that drives individuals to engage in a futile struggle. They are motivated by the belief that they can transcend their limitations, but this very desire is rooted in the misconception that they are separate from the whole. The tragic irony is that the more individuals attempt to affirm their separate selves, the further they move away from the ultimate reality of unity with the absolute. 2. Self-sacrifice and the desire for control. In Bradley's framework, true fulfillment and ethical life are only possible when the individual transcends the ego and aligns with the greater social and moral order. The dissolution of the self into the absolute is seen as the ultimate goal. However, the darker motivation here lies in the human tendency to resist this self-sacrifice, driven by an unconscious desire for control. The fear of losing control. Human beings are, by nature, driven by a desire for control. The desire for personal autonomy and self-preservation often conflicts with the ideal of self-abandonment that Bradley espouses. People are motivated by a deep-seated fear of losing control over their lives and identities. This fear often manifests in resistance to ethical or philosophical systems that demand self-sacrifice, as people struggle to maintain their sense of individualism and autonomy. The darker aspect of this desire for control is that it leads individuals to cling to material or societal markers of success, such as wealth, status, or personal achievement. These external measures of control become a substitute for the deeper, more fulfilling union with the absolute. However, this external validation is ultimately hollow, as it is rooted in the very illusion of separateness that Bradley critiques. The more individuals strive to maintain control, the more they are trapped in a cycle of superficiality, constantly seeking external validation that can never provide true satisfaction. The tragic consequences of resistance to self-sacrifice. Bradley suggests that ethical growth requires the dissolution of the self into the greater social and moral order. But most individuals resist this process, fearing that it would mean the loss of their identity. This resistance leads to tragic consequences, as people are motivated by a sense of pride or self-importance, rather than the desire to act for the greater good. The result is a fragmentation of the self, where individuals live in opposition to the moral and social order. They are driven by desires that do not align with the greater unity Bradley envisions. This creates a deep moral and existential conflict, as individuals are torn between their self-interest and the demands of the greater whole. The darker motivation here is the refusal to surrender control, which only deepens the individual's alienation from the true moral life. 3. The failure of ethical systems. Bradley's ethical system revolves around the idea that true morality can only be realized when individuals transcend their personal desires and align their will with the greater moral order of society. However, the darker side of his philosophy reveals that human beings often fail to live up to these ethical ideals. The discrepancy between ideal and reality. The ideal of ethical perfection is one of Bradley's central concerns, but human beings are often motivated by self-interest, which leads to a failure to embody the moral principles they espouse. People often adhere to ethical systems not out of a deep commitment to the moral order, but because of social pressures or the desire for self-validation. The discrepancy between ideal and reality creates a moral dissonance, where individuals act in ways that contradict their ethical beliefs. Bradley's critique of ethical systems highlights the limitations of human motivation. People may strive for moral excellence, but their motivations are often influenced by selfish desires or social conformity. This creates a dark, cynical view of morality, where ethical ideals are compromised by human weaknesses. Moral superficiality and the desire for validation. One of the darker motivations that underpins the failure of ethical systems is the desire for moral validation. People often engage in ethical behavior not because they believe in the moral good, but because they wish to be seen as morally upright by others. This superficial engagement with ethics undermines the true purpose of moral living. The motivation to appear ethical, rather than to act ethically, leads to moral hypocrisy. Individuals may adhere to social norms or ethical codes because they provide external validation, not because they reflect an internal commitment to moral values. This creates a society where ethical behavior is often performative, driven by the desire to conform to societal expectations rather than to achieve genuine moral growth. 4. Alienation from the absolute. One of the core themes in Bradley's idealism is the concept of alienation. He argues that human beings are alienated from the absolute, the totality of reality, because they are trapped in their finite, subjective experiences. This alienation is a key aspect of the human condition, motivating individuals to seek unity with the greater whole. The desperate search for meaning. The alienation from the absolute creates a deep sense of existential dissatisfaction. People are motivated by a subconscious longing for transcendence, yet this longing is ultimately futile. The darker motivation here is that the more people search for meaning, the more they are confronted with the limitations of their own perception. The search for unity with the absolute becomes an obsession, one that drives individuals to seek fulfillment in various ways, through religion, philosophy, or personal achievement. However, these pursuits are ultimately inadequate, as they fail to provide the deeper sense of unity and meaning that people crave. The futility of human striving. Bradley's metaphysical idealism posits that true fulfillment comes only when individuals align themselves with the absolute. However, the reality is that human beings are incapable of fully realizing the absolute due to the limitations of their finite selves. This creates a tragic tension, as individuals are driven by a deep-seated need to transcend their limitations, but this transcendence is ultimately unattainable. The futility of human striving is one of the darker motivations in Bradley's philosophy. People are motivated by the belief that they can achieve unity with the absolute, but this belief is rooted in an illusion. As a result, individuals are caught in a perpetual cycle of striving and disappointment, never fully achieving the peace and fulfillment they desire. 5. The tension between individual and collective good. Bradley's ethical framework emphasizes the harmony that should exist between the individual and the collective moral order. He argues that true ethical living occurs when the individual's will aligns with the greater moral reality. However, the darker motivation arises from the tension between personal desires and the greater good of society. Self-interest versus collective morality. The conflict between individual desires and the demands of the collective moral order is one of the central tensions in Bradley's philosophy. While the ideal is for the individual to act in accordance with the collective good, human beings are often motivated by self-interest. This creates a moral conflict, as individuals are torn between their personal desires and the ethical demands of society. The darker aspect of this tension is that individuals often prioritize their own goals over the well-being of others, manipulating the collective good for personal gain. This can manifest in various ways, from overtly selfish acts to more subtle forms of manipulation, where individuals justify their self-interested behavior by appealing to moral or social norms. Exploitation and alienation. The struggle between the individual and the collective can also lead to exploitation and alienation. When individuals act out of self-interest, they can exploit others or undermine the collective moral order. This exploitation further fractures the sense of community and solidarity, as people are motivated by their own desires rather than a commitment to the common good. Bradley's ideal of a harmonious relationship between individual and collective morality is, therefore, constantly threatened by the darker motivations of egoism and self-interest. This creates a society where ethical behavior is often compromised, and individuals are alienated from the larger moral whole. 6. The inevitability of frustration and unfulfilled desire. Bradley's metaphysics suggests that human beings are constantly striving for unity with the absolute, yet this striving is inherently futile. The finite self can never fully realize the infinite, and the pursuit of unity with the absolute leads to frustration and dissatisfaction. The endless cycle of desire. The darker motivation here arises from the endless cycle of desire and frustration. Human beings are driven by the desire to transcend their limitations, but no matter how hard they strive, they are always confronted with their own finitude. This creates a situation where individuals are perpetually unsatisfied, driven by desires that can never be fully realized. Bradley's philosophy suggests that this frustration is not something that can be easily escaped. The more individuals pursue unity with the Absolute, the more they are confronted with the limitations of their own existence. This creates a sense of futility, where the drive for fulfillment becomes a source of existential despair. The darker motivation is the constant striving for something that can never be attained, which results in a never-ending cycle of frustration. The loss of meaning in the struggle. As individuals continue to pursue unattainable goals, they begin to lose sight of the meaning behind their efforts. The motivation to strive for unity with the Absolute becomes a hollow pursuit, driven not by a genuine belief in the possibility of fulfillment but by a compulsive need to seek meaning in a world that offers no resolution. This loss of meaning leads to existential disillusionment, where individuals begin to question the very value of their struggles. The existential frustration described by Bradley becomes the defining characteristic of human existence. People are motivated by the need for fulfillment, but this need is ultimately unfulfilled, leaving them in a state of perpetual longing and dissatisfaction. 7. The tragic inevitability of conflict. Bradley suggests that human beings are inherently conflicted because they are finite individuals striving for unity with the infinite. This tension between the finite self and the infinite reality creates an existential struggle that defines the human condition. The internal conflict between desire and reality. The darker motivation here lies in the tragic inevitability of this internal conflict. Human beings are driven by the desire to transcend their limitations and achieve unity with the Absolute, yet this desire is fundamentally at odds with the reality of their finite nature. The conflict between what individuals desire and what they are capable of achieving becomes an ever-present source of existential struggle. The darker side of this conflict is that it is inescapable. No matter how hard individuals strive, they cannot overcome their finite limitations. This creates a sense of frustration, where the individual is perpetually at war with themselves, torn between their aspirations for transcendence and the reality of their own limitations. The struggle for meaning in a fragmented world. Bradley's philosophy suggests that the human condition is characterized by fragmentation and conflict. Individuals are motivated by the desire to transcend their own limitations, but the very nature of their existence ensures that this transcendence will never be fully realized. This creates a situation where the struggle for meaning becomes a defining characteristic of human life. The motivation to overcome conflict and achieve unity is constant, yet it remains fundamentally unattainable. The darker motivation here is the awareness that the struggle is both necessary and futile, leading individuals to seek meaning in a world that can never provide it. 8. The desire to escape the self. Bradley's idealism suggests that individuals must transcend their limited, finite selves in order to align with the Absolute. This desire to escape the self is a central theme in his philosophy, but it also reveals a darker side to human motivation. The fear of the self and the drive to escape it. The darker motivation here arises from the fear of the self. Human beings are often motivated by a desire to escape their own limitations and transcend the ego. This desire stems from a deep-seated fear of the self, of one's own inadequacies and limitations. The individual's recognition of their own fragmentation creates a sense of existential dread, motivating them to seek ways to escape from themselves. This drive to escape the self can take many forms, from religious or spiritual transcendence to self-destructive behaviors. People may seek to obliterate the self through external means such as addiction, conformity, or excessive work. These behaviors provide temporary relief from the fear of the self but ultimately deepen the individual's alienation and frustration. The paradox of self-transcendence. Bradley's ideal of self-transcendence is ultimately paradoxical. In order to achieve true unity with the Absolute, individuals must dissolve their separate selves. However, the desire to escape the self is often driven by a fear of the self, leading to a contradiction. Individuals seek to transcend the very thing that they fear, but do so in ways that only reinforce their sense of fragmentation. This paradox creates a dark motivation, as individuals are trapped in a cycle of seeking transcendence while simultaneously avoiding the very thing that would allow them to achieve it. The drive to escape the self becomes a source of self-sabotage, preventing the individual from fully realizing the unity they seek. 9. The tyranny of social expectations. Bradley's philosophy stresses the importance of social life and collective morality, where the individual's ethical development is intimately connected with their role in society. However, this emphasis on social order also reveals the darker side of human motivation, the pressure to conform to societal expectations. Conformity and the suppression of the authentic self. The darker motivation here arises from the desire to avoid social rejection. Human beings are motivated by the need to belong, and this need often leads them to conform to societal norms, even when these norms conflict with their true desires. The pressure to conform to social expectations becomes a form of tyranny, as individuals suppress their authentic selves in order to fit into a predefined mold. The result is a society where individuals are motivated not by true ethical conviction but by the desire to avoid alienation or judgment. This leads to a shallow, performative morality, where people act ethically not because they believe in it, but because they fear the consequences of nonconformity. The erosion of individuality. The tyranny of social expectations can lead to the erosion of individuality. Individuals become motivated by the need to maintain their social status and avoid alienation, leading them to act in ways that are socially acceptable rather than morally authentic. This erodes the sense of self and creates a society where conformity is valued over individuality. The darker motivation here is the desire to preserve one's social standing at the expense of personal integrity. People are motivated to fit in, to be seen as morally upright, even when this means sacrificing their own authentic beliefs and desires. This creates a world where individuals are disconnected from their true selves, motivated by the need to conform rather than the desire to live authentically. 10. The futility of ethical perfection. Bradley's ethical philosophy encourages individuals to strive for moral excellence, but the darker side of this ideal lies in the recognition that ethical perfection may be unattainable. The impossibility of moral perfection. Bradley's ethical idealism promotes the idea of striving for moral perfection, but the recognition that such perfection is impossible creates a dark motivation. People are driven to achieve ethical ideals, but the realization that these ideals are unattainable often leads to frustration and despair. The darker motivation here is the constant striving for perfection, even though it is clear that perfection cannot be achieved. This sense of futility can lead to moral disillusionment, where individuals no longer see the value in striving for ethical growth. The motivation to achieve moral perfection becomes a source of existential frustration, as people come to terms with the impossibility of their goals. Moral apathy and disillusionment. The recognition of the futility of moral striving can lead to moral apathy. People may become disillusioned with ethical ideals, seeing them as unrealistic and unattainable. This disillusionment can result in a loss of motivation to act morally, as individuals begin to question the worth of ethical efforts in a world where moral perfection is out of reach. This darker motivation, the loss of faith in moral ideals, undermines the very foundation of ethical living. It leads to a moral stagnation, where individuals no longer strive for moral growth, contributing to a sense of existential disillusionment.